I remember the exact moment my childhood ended. I was 10 years old, sitting cross-legged on our living room floor, when my parents sat me down for an important talk. Mom was perched on the edge of our beige couch, hands clasped tightly in her lap, while Dad leaned against the fireplace mantel, unable to meet my eyes. "Hannah, sweetie," Mom began, her voice wavering slightly. "Your father and I need to tell you something." I looked between them, my stomach already knotting up. Even at 10, I could sense when something was terribly wrong. The air felt heavy, like right before a thunderstorm. "Your mother and I," Dad cleared his throat, finally looking at me, "we don't love each other anymore. We've decided to get divorced." The word divorced hit me like a physical blow. Sure, I'd heard it before, some kids at school had divorced parents, but I never thought it would happen to us. We were the family that had Sunday pancake breakfasts and game nights. How could that just end? The next few weeks passed in a blur of boxes and court meetings. The judge decided I would live primarily with Mom in a rented apartment across town, but I could visit Dad whenever I wanted in our family home. The house I'd lived in since birth. The house where my height marks were penciled on the kitchen doorframe, where I'd learned to walk, where every corner held a memory. I tried to be brave about it all. Mom seemed sad enough without me adding to her worries, and Dad looked so guilty whenever he saw me crying that I started hiding my tears. I told myself it would be okay. Lots of kids had divorced parents. At least mine were being nice about it, not fighting like Jennifer's parents did during their divorce. But then, barely a year later, Dad dropped another bombshell. "Hannah, I want you to meet someone special," he said during one of my weekend visits. "Her name is Patricia, and, well, we're getting married." I remember staring at him, not quite processing the words. Married? But before I could really wrap my head around having a stepmother, he added something that temporarily brightened my spirits. "She has a daughter your age, Megan. You'll have a sister." A sister? Despite my confusion and hurt about Dad moving on so quickly, that word sparked a tiny flame of hope in my chest. I'd always wanted a sister. Maybe this change wouldn't be so bad after all. Oh, how wrong I was. The first meeting with Patricia and Megan was scheduled for the following weekend. I spent the whole week imagining all the fun things we'd do together, sharing secrets, having sleepovers, maybe even becoming best friends. I pictured us as those inseparable sisters you see in movies, the ones who finish each other's sentences and stand up for each other no matter what. I spent hours picking out my outfit for that first meeting. I chose my favorite yellow sundress, the one Mom said made me look like sunshine, and even asked her to braid my hair in that fancy way she did for special occasions. The drive to Dad's house felt different that day. Usually, I'd bounce with excitement as we turned onto our street, but this time my stomach was doing nervous flips. When Mom's car pulled up to the curb, I saw unfamiliar curtains in the windows, light purple ones that definitely weren't there the week before. I walked up the familiar path to our front door. Before I could reach for the doorbell, something I'd never had to use before, the door swung open. There stood a tall woman with perfectly styled blonde hair and sharp features, wearing an outfit that looked like it came straight from a magazine cover. "You must be Hannah," she said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "I'm Patricia." Behind her stood a girl my age, but that's where our similarities ended. While I was in my simple sundress, she wore what looked like designer clothes. Her nose wrinkled slightly as she looked me up and down, and I instantly felt underdressed in my own home. "I'm Megan," she said, her tone making it clear she wasn't particularly interested in meeting me. Dad appeared then, grinning like everything was perfect. "Hannah Banana. Come in, come in. I want to show you how we've set everything up." My heart froze as we walked upstairs. Something felt wrong. Then I saw it. My room, my sanctuary since I was born, had been completely transformed. The soft blue walls I'd helped Dad paint last summer were now a pristine white. My butterfly decorations were gone, replaced by fashion posters and fairy lights. My furniture had been completely rearranged, and unfamiliar items covered every surface. But worst of all were the cardboard boxes stacked in the hallway. I recognized my things poking out of them, my books, my stuffed animals, my entire life packed away like old newspapers. Dad? My voice cracked. What happened to my room? Oh, honey, Dad said, running a hand through his hair, something he always did when he was uncomfortable. Well, you see, Megan really liked this room. But it's my room, I interrupted, something I rarely did with Dad. I've lived here my whole life. Nothing terrible has happened, Dad said quickly. The room is perfect for Megan, you know how beautiful it is, with the garden access and all the natural light. We've set up the guest room upstairs for you. It's cozy. I stared at him in disbelief as he continued, besides, sweetheart, you're only here part-time now. Megan will be living here permanently, and she needs to feel comfortable in her new home. We have to help her adjust, right? The guest room is perfectly fine for your visits. Megan smirked behind Dad's back, already claiming my space as her territory. Patricia stood with her hand on Dad's shoulder, the picture of supportive new wife, but I saw the triumph in her eyes. Life in what used to be my home became an exercise in endurance. Every visit felt like walking through a minefield, never knowing what small cruelty awaited me around each corner. Patricia and Megan had turned making me feel unwelcome into an art form. Dinner's ready, Patricia would call out cheerfully on my visiting days, and I'd walk into the kitchen to find every dish swimming in chili peppers and hot sauce. She knew perfectly well I couldn't handle spicy food. Dad had told her about my sensitive stomach when they first got married. Oh, I'm sorry, Hannah, she'd say with fake concern when I'd push my plate away, tears in my eyes from just the smell. I forgot you don't like spicy food. There's bread in the pantry if you're hungry. One particularly hot summer day, I came downstairs in my swimsuit, excited to cool off in our pool, one of the few things that still felt like home. Oh no. You can't swim today, Patricia said, not even looking up from her magazine. We're doing the monthly cleaning. But you just did the cleaning last weekend when I was here, I pointed out. Well, we're doing it again, she snapped, finally looking at me over her designer sunglasses. Better safe than sorry. I watched through the window later that day as Megan splashed around in that same cleaning pool, Patricia lounging nearby with a satisfied smile. Dad seemed oblivious to it all. Or maybe he just didn't want to see it. He was so in love with Patricia, always looking at her like she hung the moon. I couldn't bring myself to tell him how they treated me when his back was turned. What if he didn't believe me? Or worse, what if he did believe me but chose them anyway? So I stayed quiet. I learned to pack sandwiches in my overnight bag. I stopped bringing my swimsuit. I started declining weekend stays, making excuses about homework or plans with friends. My weeks-long visits became weekend visits. Weekend visits became day visits. Day visits became quick hello and goodbye stops. The hardest part wasn't the deliberate exclusion or the subtle bullying. It was Dad's reaction, or rather, his lack of reaction. He never asked why I stopped staying overnight. Never questioned why I barely touched my dinner. Never wondered why his once swimming-obsessed daughter suddenly lost interest in the pool. Instead, I started noticing something that hurt more than all of Patricia's and Megan's tricks combined, the look of relief on Dad's face when I'd leave. It was subtle, just a small relaxation of his shoulders, a barely audible sigh, but I saw it. Every single time. 5 years passed like a slow healing wound, until one day Mom told me she had someone special she wanted me to meet. After Dad's remarriage, I'd been wary of someone special, but David turned out to be different from the very first handshake. Hannah, he said, his warm brown eyes crinkling at the corners when he smiled, I've heard so much about you. Your mom says you're quite the artist? It was such a small thing, remembering that detail about my hobby, but it meant everything. Here was someone who had actually listened when Mom talked about me, who seemed genuinely interested in knowing who I was. David didn't have kids of his own, and maybe that's why he tried so hard. Or maybe that's just who he was, kind, attentive, present. He'd ask about my day and actually listen to the answer. He'd remember things I mentioned weeks ago and follow up on them. Hey, Hannah, he'd say, how did that science project about butterflies turn out? The contrast with my own father couldn't have been starker. While Dad was making excuses to end our increasingly rare visits, David was showing up to my art shows and school events. When parent-teacher conferences came around, it was David who sat there taking notes and asking questions about my progress, while Dad texted last-minute cancellations. I spent a lot of nights wondering why a stranger could love me more than my own father. Why David, who had no obligation to care, showed up for everything, while Dad treated me like an inconvenient reminder of his past life. Eventually, I stopped asking why. Some questions don't have satisfying answers. High school graduation came and went. Dad showed up for the ceremony but left immediately after, citing some commitment with Megan. David took us all out to celebrate, beaming with pride as if I were his own flesh and blood. College was next, with Mom and Dad splitting the tuition. It was the most involvement Dad had shown in years, though all communication went through their lawyers. I chose a university several states away, partly for its art program, but mostly for the distance it put between me and my father's new life. Those 4 years transformed our already strained relationship into something that barely existed. Our interaction dwindled to occasional video calls, which became a new form of torture. Dad would appear on screen, attempting small talk, while Patricia lurked in the background with her perpetual look of disapproval. John, she'd call out during every call, without fail. We need to discuss something important. Or, John, I need your help with this urgent matter. Or, John, Megan needs to talk to you about something critical. The calls never lasted more than 5 minutes. Dad would apologize, promise to call back soon, and disappear. He never called back. I graduated college with honors. David and Mom were there, cheering loudly as I walked across the stage. Dad sent a text message, "Congratulations. Sorry, I couldn't make it. Megan had a dance recital." By then, I knew nothing about my stepsister's life, nor did I want to. The last real thing I knew about her was that she'd taken my room, my father, and any chance at having the family I'd once dreamed about. Life has a funny way of surprising you when you least expect it. For me, that surprise came in the form of Michael, who quite literally ran into me at a coffee shop one rainy morning after graduation. He was rushing in as I was rushing out, and both our laptops went flying. We spent the next hour making sure our devices still worked, and somehow that turned into lunch, which turned into dinner, which turned into the next several years of my life. Michael was different from anyone I'd ever met. He listened the way David did, laughed at my terrible puns, and understood my complicated family situation without judgment. Most importantly, he never pushed me to mend things with my father, but he supported me when I wanted to try. After 3 years together, on a regular Tuesday evening while we were doing dishes, Michael turned to me with soap suds up to his elbows and said, "We should get married." It wasn't the grand romantic gesture some girls dream about, but it was perfectly us. We decided on a small wedding, just close family and friends. No need for anything extravagant. We had saved enough money to pay for everything ourselves, which felt important to me. I wanted this milestone to be something we achieved together, without owing anyone anything. Then one evening, staring at our guest list, I felt a familiar ache in my chest. Despite everything, he was still my father. And weddings were supposed to be about family, about new beginnings. Maybe this could be our new beginning too. I called him on a Sunday afternoon, my hands shaking as I dialed the number I barely used anymore. "Dad, it's Hannah." "Hannah. What a surprise." He actually sounded happy to hear from me. "How are you?" "I'm good. Great, actually. I'm getting married, Dad." The silence on the other end lasted just a moment too long before he said, "Married? That's wonderful news, sweetheart."
Yeah.
I twisted the engagement ring on my finger. And I was wondering, hoping really, would you walk me down the aisle? Of course. His response was immediate, enthusiastic even. Of course I will. My little girl, getting married. When's the wedding? We talked for almost an hour that day, longer than we had in years. He asked about Michael, about our plans, about the venue. For the first time in forever, I felt like I had my dad back. I threw myself into wedding planning with renewed energy. Everything was falling into place, the venue, the flowers, the dress. I even started having dreams about Dad walking me down the aisle, just like I'd imagined when I was little. Then, 2 months before the wedding, my phone rang. Dad's name flashed on the screen. "Hannah," he said, his voice strange and distant. "I need to tell you something. I can't walk you down the aisle." The world seemed to tilt sideways. What? Why not? But no matter how many times I asked, he wouldn't give me a straight answer. He just kept repeating that he couldn't do it, that he was sorry, that it was complicated. After my father's phone call, I felt like I was drowning in questions. None of his vague excuses made sense, and I knew there was only one person who would give me the unvarnished truth: Aunt Sarah. Dad's sister had always been the keeper of family secrets, and more importantly, she'd always been honest with me, even when the truth hurt. I called her that same evening, my hands still shaking from Dad's call. "Aunt Sarah, I need to know what's really going on with Dad." The long sigh on the other end of the line told me this wasn't going to be good news. "Oh, honey. I was wondering when you'd call." "So you know why he's not coming to my wedding?" "I do, and you deserve to know the truth. Your stepsister Megan is getting married too." My stomach clenched. "What does that have to do with anything?" "Everything, unfortunately. Megan demanded that your father walk her down the aisle. When she found out he was going to walk you down the aisle at your wedding, she completely lost it. Threw the tantrum of the century. But she's not even his daughter," I whispered. "That's not how Patricia sees it. She's been working on your father day and night, telling him that Megan is practically his real daughter now because she's lived with him all these years. She keeps saying that blood doesn't matter, that it's about who's been there." I felt bile rising in my throat. "Who's been there?" "They're the ones who pushed me out." "I know, sweetie. But there's more. Megan actually moved her wedding date up specifically to get married before you. She wanted to make sure she got your father first. And Hannah, there's something else you should know. Your father, he's paying for her entire wedding. Every last penny." The words hit me like physical blows. My father, who hadn't contributed a dime to my wedding, who hadn't even offered to help, was funding his stepdaughter's entire celebration. The same man who had given away my childhood bedroom, who had slowly pushed me out of his life, was now giving away what should have been my moment too. "How much?" I heard myself ask, though I wasn't sure why it mattered. "Honey." "How much, Aunt Sarah?" She told me. The number made me physically ill. It was more than triple what Michael and I had scraped together for our entire wedding. "I'm so sorry, Hannah." I told him he was making a horrible mistake. But Patricia and Megan, they've got him wrapped around their fingers. They gave him an ultimatum: either he chooses Megan's wedding or yours. And well, you know his choice now. I hung up shortly after, unable to bear hearing any more. The father I remembered from my childhood, the one who used to call me his Hannah Banana and paint my bedroom walls whatever color I wanted, was gone. In his place was a man who would trade his own daughter's happiness for a moment of peace in his new life. After my conversation with Aunt Sarah, I spent several sleepless nights thinking about who should walk me down the aisle. The answer, once I allowed myself to see it, was obvious. I invited David to coffee one morning before work. "David, I have something important to ask you," I said, fidgeting with my coffee cup. Would you walk me down the aisle?" His eyes widened in surprise. "Hannah, I'm honored, but shouldn't your father do that?" "I don't want to overstep." I took a deep breath and told him everything, about Megan's wedding, the ultimatum, Dad paying for her entire celebration. David's face darkened as I spoke. When I finished, he reached across the table and took my hand. There were tears in his eyes. "Hannah," his voice was thick with emotion, "it would be the greatest honor of my life to walk you down the aisle. You're the daughter I never had, and I love you like my own." When my wedding was a month and a half away, my father showed up unannounced at my apartment. His appearance was so unexpected that I almost closed the door in his face. "Hannah, wait," he said quickly. "I've changed my mind, I want to walk you down the aisle." I stood frozen in the doorway. "What? Why the sudden change of heart?" He shifted uncomfortably. Megan's biological father showed up. Turns out he's some big shot businessman now. He found out about the wedding and reached out. Made some very generous gestures. And now, well, Megan wants him to walk her down the aisle instead. The laugh that escaped me was bitter. So I'm your second choice? Again? Hannah, please understand. Oh, I understand perfectly. Megan kicked you to the curb, so now you're crawling back to me. It's not like that. Look, what will the family think if some other man walks my daughter down the aisle? I felt my blood boil. The family? Now you care what they think. Where was this concern when you were paying for Megan's entire wedding while giving me nothing? Should we ask the family what they think about that? That's different. How about when you let your wife and stepdaughter push me out of my own home? Did you care what the family thought then? Those were just childhood misunderstandings, he protested. We can start fresh now. Let the past be the past. Misunderstandings? My voice rose. You gave away my room, my home, my father, and now you want to pretend none of that happened because your backup plan fell through? If you don't let me walk you down the aisle, I won't come to the wedding at all, he said, his voice hard. I looked at this man, this stranger wearing my father's face, and felt nothing but pity. That's your choice to make, I said quietly. Just like it was your choice every other time you picked them over me. David will walk me down the aisle. At least he chose me first. After my father left that day, I called Mom and David. We met for dinner, and I told them everything. Oh, sweetie, Mom said, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. You did the right thing. He doesn't deserve to walk you down the aisle if he only wants to do it as a last resort. David nodded solemnly. We support whatever decision you make, Hannah. This is your day, and it should be exactly how you want it. In 2 weeks, curiosity got the better of me. I found myself scrolling through social media, looking at photos from Megan's wedding a couple of days earlier. There she was, radiant in a designer gown that probably cost more than my entire wedding budget, her arm linked with her biological father's. He looked successful, confident, everything my father had always wanted to be. And there, in the background of several photos, stood my father. Head slightly bowed, looking lost at the wedding he'd paid for but wasn't needed at. Patricia stood beside him, her face tight with barely concealed anger. I felt a moment of satisfaction, followed by sadness, not for him, but for the relationship we'd never have. My own wedding day dawned bright and clear. As I stood with David outside the church doors, waiting for our cue, he turned to me with tears in his eyes. Hannah, he whispered, I want you to know something. I may not have been there for your first steps or your first words, but being here for this moment, it means everything to me. I hugged him tightly, careful not to wrinkle my dress. You've been more of a father to me than anyone else. The ceremony was beautiful in its simplicity. I could hear the whispers as David walked me down the aisle, relatives wondering where my father was, why this other man was in his place. But their confusion didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was the love in that room, Michael's face as he saw me for the first time, Mom's happy tears, David's proud smile as he placed my hand in my soon-to-be husband's. That was 3 months ago. Life has settled into a comfortable rhythm now. Michael and I are creating our own traditions, our own definition of family. I hear bits and pieces about my father through Aunt Sarah, how things are strained between him and Megan now that she has her real father back in her life, how Patricia is bitter about the whole situation. But those stories feel like chapters from someone else's book, no longer part of my story. Sometimes, late at night, Michael asks if I regret my decision. I think about David's tears as he walked me down the aisle, about Mom's unwavering support, about the family I've chosen rather than the one I was born into. The answer is always no. I've learned that family isn't about DNA or obligation. It's about choice. It's about showing up, staying present, loving consistently. My father may have forgotten these lessons, but in doing so, he taught me exactly what kind of parent I want to be someday. For now, I'm focusing on the family I do have, my loving husband, my supportive mother, and the man who chose to be my father when my own father chose not to be. Sometimes the happy ending isn't what you imagined as a child. Sometimes it's better.